Happy New Year! Well, alright, that was a little underwhelming. Fallout funds, closeout, bona fide need, appropriation, color of money, UFRs, budgetary constraints, the end of the federal government's fiscal year. What the heck does all this mean? You hear these terms used every year right around the end of the summer season. But how exactly does this apply to you as the mission partner or end user of a requirement? If you are nearing the end of the month of September and you're just now learning about these terms, I've got news for you. You're a little too late. In conjunction with the ending of another Earth's rotation around the sun, I'm covering the end of the fiscal year. What is it, how it affects your requirements, and what you can do now to prepare for the end of FY26 earlier in the calendar year. But before we dive in, welcome to the channel. My name is Josh, and I'm a warranted government contracting officer currently working for the United States Air Force. On this channel, we focus on demystifying and breaking down the essentials of government contracting so you can better understand the process and navigate it with confidence. If you're not already subscribed and you'd like to support what I'm building for the acquisition community, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Now with that, let's get started. The end of the government's fiscal year is a somewhat misunderstood and stressful period in federal acquisitions. Every September, phrases like use it or lose it, fallout funds, and unfunded requirements start circulating rapidly. But behind the urgency is a very rigid legal framework that governs how, when, and why federal funds can be obligated. In this episode, we are going to break down what the end of the fiscal year actually is, why it matters, how mission partners should prepare their requirements, and how commanders, resource advisors, finance, and contracting all fit together in the larger budget execution picture. Let's start with the foundation. The United States government operates on a fiscal year that begins on October 1st and ends on September 30th. This fiscal calendar is established by statute, and it applies across federal agencies, including the Department of War, previously known as the DoD. When Congress passes an Appropriations Act for a given fiscal year, those funds are made legally available for obligation only within the period of availability specified in the law. For most operation and maintenance funds, also known as O&M, that period of availability is one fiscal year. That means funds appropriated for fiscal year 2026 must be obligated no later than September 30th of that year. Once that date passes, those funds expire and can no longer be used to incur new obligations. This is why the end of the fiscal year matters so much. At the end of each year, agencies are not racing against an arbitrary deadline. They are operating against a legal boundary defined by appropriations law. Any obligation made after funds expire or in excess of the amount available risks violating that fiscal law. One of the most important rules in this space is the bona fide need rule. This rule requires that appropriated funds be used only for goods or services that represent a legitimate or bona fide need. In simple terms, current year money must be used to satisfy current year needs, unless a specific statutory exception applies. Closely tied to that is the Antideficiency Act. The Antideficiency Act prohibits federal employees from obligating or expending funds before they are appropriated, or in amounts greater than what Congress has authorized. Violations are serious. They require formal reporting and can result in administrative or disciplinary action. This is where a lot of the end of the fiscal year confusion comes from. The government is not allowed to spend money simply because it is about to expire. There must be a valid requirement, properly documented, that aligns with the purpose, time, and amount limitations of the appropriation. Understanding this distinction is critical. An obligation occurs when the government makes a legally binding commitment, such as awarding a contract, issuing a purchase order, or executing a funded modification. At the end of the fiscal year, the focus is on obligating funds before they expire. not necessarily spending the money immediately. Now let's talk about a term that gets thrown around a lot at the end of the year: fallout funds. Fallout funds are not a separate category of money. They are typically funds that become available late in the fiscal year due to contract underruns, deobligations, cancellations, or requirements that were planned but ultimately not executed. These funds retain their original appropriation identity and period of availability. They do not reset the clock, and they are not exempt from fiscal law. Fallout funds can be used only if there is a valid bona fide need that fits within the remaining period of availability. That means mission partners cannot invent requirements simply to absorb available funds. Any obligation still requires proper justification, documentation, and legal review. Another commonly misunderstood concept at the end of the fiscal year is the unfunded requirement, often referred to as a UFR. A UFR exists when a unit or organization identifies a legitimate mission requirement that cannot be funded within its approved budget. These requirements are typically compiled into unfunded priorities lists and elevated through the chain of command. They may be presented to Congress as part of the budget justification process, but they are not guaranteed funding. For fiscal year 25, for example, the Department of the Air Force identified billions of dollars in unfunded priorities tied to readiness, munitions, sustainment, and modernization efforts. These lists help senior leaders and lawmakers understand risk areas, but they do not provide spending authority on their own. That distinction is important. A UFR is a planning and advocacy tool, not an authorization to obligate funds. Now let's zoom out and talk about how the budget itself gets to the unit level. The budget life cycle begins with the President's budget submission, followed by authorization through the National Defense Authorization Act, and then actual funding through appropriation acts passed by Congress. Once appropriations are enacted, funds are distributed across the Department of War and allocated down through major commands, installations, and ultimately to wings, squadrons, and staff offices. For fiscal year 2026, the Department of the Air Force requested approximately $209 billion across personnel, operations and maintenance, procurement, research and development, and military construction accounts. Each one of these appropriations carries its own purpose, time, and amount constraints. At the unit level, commanders define mission priorities and operational needs. Resource advisors translate those needs into funding strategies, aligning requirements to the correct appropriation and fiscal year. Finance offices track execution, monitor obligation rates, and ensure funds are available and properly certified. Contracting officers execute the legal instruments that obligate the funds, also known as a contract award. Contracting's role at the end of fiscal year is not to spend money, it is to ensure that obligations are legally sound, properly funded, and compliant with fiscal law. That includes confirming the availability of funds, validating the bona fide need rule, ensuring the correct appropriation is cited, and awarding contracts within the period of availability. As the end of fiscal year approaches, pressure increases across the system. Timelines compress, workloads spike, and the margin for error shrinks. This is where early planning becomes essential. Mission partners who prepare well for the end of fiscal year start many months in advance. They define requirements early, complete acquisition planning, validate funding lines, and engage resource advisors and contracting as soon as possible. Waiting until September to identify a requirement dramatically increases risk, both legally and operationally. This is often why a contracting officer may reject or defer a requirement at the end of the fiscal year. It may be simply too late to complete the necessary market research, competition, reviews, and approvals required to legally award the action. In other cases, the requirement may be too complex, too high in dollar value, or not sufficiently defined to execute within the remaining time available. In these situations, contracting officers are not being pessimistic. They are being realistic and legally responsible. The reality is that federal acquisitions is governed by process and statute, and when requirements arrive late or incomplete, there may not be enough time left in the fiscal year to execute them properly. As the old saying goes, poor planning on your part does not constitute urgency on my part. That's just the reality of it all. From a fiscal law perspective, the most common end of fiscal year risks include obligating funds for future year needs, exceeding available funding, or rushing incomplete requirements into contract actions that later require corrective action. These risks can be mitigated through deliberate planning, clear communication, and respect for the legal framework governing appropriated funds. So the takeaway is this: the end of the fiscal year is not about spending money quickly or purchasing gratuitous standing desks for the sake of maintaining next fiscal year's budget amount. It is about executing the budget Congress provided within the law to support mission requirements. When commanders, resource advisors, finance, and contracting operate in sync, the end of fiscal year becomes a disciplined execution process rather than a last-minute scramble. Understanding fiscal law, planning ahead, and respecting the roles each organization plays is what separates effective stewardship from unnecessary risk. That is the real lesson of the end of fiscal year. If you like this video and you want to support the channel, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another acquisition pro tip.